Future research directions. This grammar doesn't include death rules at this point. Most of the grammar has been done for radius 1. We have enough stuff done for radius 2 and radius 3 to show that the rules are either identical or they're analogous. There's a slight problem with a single dot to a big square. Can't do that with birth on 2. It won't grow. So there are certain configurations of 2 squares that will work and it will grow. So it is analogous. 3 squares do the same thing. Second possibility is to investigate the relationship between the cellular automata grammar and the display grid with different kinds of grids. What happens if we use a hexagonal grid? Is the grammar still valid? Can we substitute 30 degrees for 45 and 60 degrees for 90? Does it work that way? We need to investigate collisions between patterns and whether cellular automata grammar can describe them. Special thanks to Chris McKay, who's the principal investigator for extreme environments from NASA Ames, and Penny Boston from New Mexico Tech, who's associate director of the National Cave and Karst Research Institute, for their support and encouragement since 2007. This has been a long time coming, guys. Thank you for attending, and that's all, folks. Any questions?
That's right, pick 4.
Oh, come on. Somebody's got to have a question.
Okay, Jane, can you... I mean, one of the things that's going to happen in collisions, I mean, most of your rules require space to grow.
Right.
If you have a collision, then that space is missing.
Yes.
So, do you think that could be added into the grammar somehow, or maybe it's already there?
I think maybe. I think that one... Let me go back here.
I mean, are you talking about two types of automata colliding? One runs and another runs?
No, they have to have the
Two
same
are the
rules.
same.
If you've got a grid, they have the same rules.
Yeah. For instance,
But the same ones?
Yeah.
Or any?
If
They
you're emulating...
grow and they grow back
Yeah,
in.
you can have one here, one here, they grow, and all of a sudden
Now,
it
you
starts.
already have some kinds in your fractal rules, the dancing squares pattern.
They grow back in.
They grow back in, they collide, and it stops
They
their
collide,
growth. So
they
you
die,
already
and it goes
have.
back in.
The only
Right.
thing being, of course, that is a particularly ordered.
Okay, let's
collision.
talk about this. That's a collision.
Yeah.
Right?
That is a collision. That's what happens when you have a collision. You have the 2 patterns attempt to grow, but they fail to develop
No space.
completely.
Yeah.
Lindenmeyer has
I mean, I would imagine when you have collisions, then a certain, I mean, okay, it gets a little denser, and you might need additional rules to describe that
Yeah.
density, but
But
that's
maybe you
really-
have to throw in some depth and
That's
that'll
really the issue.
sort
Do
it
we
out.
need to throw in
Jane?
extra rules?
So Lindenmeyer already has that.
I was going to say, what happens when 2 patterns collide?
Just go to your L grammar. It's the
In
answer
a
right.
It's in
way,
there.
It's
serpentine,
already in
that's
there.
amore.
It's in there.
It's already in your
Excuse us.
Lindenmeyer grammar.
Look,
Yeah.
Just
The
scroll
two
down
are-
to the rules.
there are little rules.
Okay, let's go
To
back
the
up to the
Lindenmeyer
rules.
grammar.
Because you have to have space, right?
Yes, you have to have
It's the
space.
context.
Exactly, so therefore you've got a
It's
collision
done.
covered.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, you have, I mean,
The
when
rule
they,
doesn't fire if there's no space.
exactly, but I mean, yeah, if you collide, there is a certain scenario appearing, and, well, do you have a left-hand side that matches up with this pattern? If not, then,
Well, if you don't
Then
have
nothing
but
happens.
the thing,
That
if,
rule
the
will
thing, if
never
it's
fire, so it's
bilaterally,
done.
it
I mean,
doesn't
it's-
fire unless
There
you
you go.
have both sides of the
Yeah.
context.
You know, I
and
think
could it be that it
requires-
denses up so much that just nothing fires, and
Well,
then it
I
gets...
think
kind of
what-
what
and then it's
happens
static.
is you
And
wind
it's
up, you wind up with a mapping from the neighborhood, which is a result of the rules for the cellular automata, right? Onto the Lindenmeyer thing. Okay, and what you saw with that pattern I had up over here, this little guy down here, this one, like that, is that Lindenmeyer's looking for space over here. Okay, what it turns out that lack of space is, in terms of the neighborhood, is you have one more square inside the neighborhood than the rules will allow you to grow on. Okay, and the thing to keep in mind is no square that's growing is aware of any other square that's on here. So although we're forming patterns and we're forming straight lines,
Yeah.
it's done one square at a time. So that one instance, this thing sees that it has context on one side, but it doesn't have room to grow. So it just doesn't fire. It doesn't happen, it doesn't live in the next
Unless you get death, in which case you then get an
Yeah.
open space, in which case it might fire again.
Yeah, I think entering death into the grammar, that
It's,
might,
it's going to be more complex.
that will jiggle
Yeah.
it up, that's
Jane,
loosen it up.
there is one thing that kind of just struck me, and you actually said it, but it's hard to think in those terms. So you gotta remember, the grammar applies globally and synchronously to each cell on the grid.
Right.
That's true.
And that's where, so it's not just what grows here, it's just, we gotta imagine it kind of wandering over every cell.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
No
And
cell is
updating it
aware of
once.
any other cell.
Right, and at that point
And
we can.
while we're doing it one at a time in terms of what's happening on our grid where we actually develop the pattern, the Lindemeyer thing goes, bloom, everybody
Yeah.
does it, everybody looks
Yeah.
at it,
Mhm.
it
So
happens.
once you
Yeah.
throw that in, we can probably live with simpler rules because we don't have to consider what happens if this is here or this is here or this is here.
No,
We can look
just
at
you're-
it cell
you're
by
just-
cell and it's
that's part of
global.
what I was talking about the other day when I was talking about this,
Yeah.
that I think that this is sort of like right at the ground of looking at what happens with
Mm-hmm.
collisions. Each side tries to develop whatever pattern is developing off of that side when they come together,
Mhm.
and they go as far as they can until that space doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And then the pattern fails. Both patterns fail. So what you get is an interleaving of the patterns, like this,
Yeah.
because you had two different starts, or you've got something that's concave, that's wrapped around like this,
Mhm.
and attempting to grow.
Yeah,
And so you wind up with this thing that looks, sometimes it looks like a turkey foot stitch like this. You have a seam that goes along this thing.
yeah. I
Yeah,
wanna-
frequently it's at 45 degrees as a matter of fact.
I
Some of
just-
the other,
Yeah, I know, I just want to make the comment that sometimes a very strong familiarity with standard context-free and context-sensitive grammars can actually hinder the understanding of this thing because it's a whole
Yeah,
different
this
system.
this, although I said that we did the simplest thing, the Lindemeyer grammar is actually the Gestalt thing,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Well, I mean, it's still a grammar. And I
Well,
mean,
It is a
yeah, it's
grammar.
still
what
a
you've got to
grammar.
realize is that it's no longer, we tend to think of, productions, there's life and there's death, and we think of death as just an absence of life, but it really is just, think of it in terms of A and B as your letter
Yeah.
inside, and I'm producing A or B, so I might have a production that generates either an A or a B, which we're just calling life or death in this context.
No, I
And
agree with.
we're also
So that's
thinking,
just adding extra
It is a
rules.
formal system, but we're modifying the hardware, as it were. One of the, because we're not developing, I mean, in a standard grammar, you are doing a full development on a single thread of productions. Whereas here, you have to think of it as we're doing a parallel development on a whole mess of productions.
yeah, this
And
is a
then that
massively parallel.
establishes the new context that we've got to apply. So it's still a grammar, but there is this
Well,
added
it's an
thing.
inherently parallel grammar.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
an
it's-
inherently
it's
not
inherently
modifying the
massively
hardware,
parallel.
It's inherently parallel.
Now, we can't prove it yet, but we suspect that the death we've done, let me see
Okay,
if I can
so
pull
say
the
it's
word
in a
out, it's a
different
rate, it's a
universe, if
radix,
you will.
radix diminished, where we
Whatever you.
basically saturated the whole screen with light. And then we started a pattern that we knew in death. Had no birth rules, only a death rule, and you know what? The pattern that we started developed into the same pattern we saw with the same birth rule. But they're flipped. So if we've got death on one, you're gonna have, birth on one, you're gonna wind up with death on 7, I believe.
Whereas if you have death on one, you end up with,
I don't know yet. We're still playing with that one, but we do know that the diminished radix actually works because we've done it.
Yeah.
So there's some sense that it may be the flip side of the same coin, but I think they're like two different values and you have to handle them differently.
diminished radix from what radix?
From the birth rule. From the birth rule. And remember, I told you in these that your death rule is a range of numbers, right? And that the birth rule is a single value. Well, this is what happens. Most of these were generated, except for the fractals, with a single birth rule. But the diminished radix pattern I was talking about, where we saturated it and did a pattern in death, was generated with a single death number and no birth. So it's kind of like, for those of you who remember photographic negatives, before digital photography, it's like a photographic negative of the image that you get when you apply birth rule. That's the radix of this thing. So that's kind of a little look into it, and trust me guys, there is an entire chapter that you didn't get in here because it would have taken too long. There's a whole lot more in the thesis than what you see. There's a chapter that discusses scaling. I'll give you a quick overview. We managed to develop exactly the same pattern visually with different radiuses and different birth numbers and scaled line starts. And it turns out that there is a whole range of line lengths that will work for larger radii. There's a minimum number and a maximum size that it can be. In radius 1, the minimum is actually bigger than the maximum, so you can't even grow it. Radius 2, you can grow exactly 1, and from there on, it takes off. And the other interesting thing that turns out with this thing is if you have an even radius, you have to have an even numbered line to start it or it won't grow. If you have an odd radius, you have to have an odd numbered line or it won't grow. And this is just birth and radius without any depth in it. And the pattern develops in 5 time steps. Like I said, a lot of this is in the first 5 to 10 time steps. It's not like watching 5,000 and going, oh wow, look at that. Now, this pattern up here, just for grins and giggles to go back to it, this is a cellular automata also, and I think this is 150 time steps. It's a birth on 3, death on 5 at radius 1. And I think that the scale on it's pretty close to 160, I think, for 150 time steps. It doesn't grow real fast.
So
I
Jane,
should say you haven't seen half of the beautiful things that come out of this. We've seen Aztec things, we've seen thunderbirds.
Now here's a thing I'd like to, we're sitting right at the limit of formal systems because a lot of the stuff we're describing, I mean we're talking about, for instance, 2 patterns at different radius, different step and whatever that look the same. Now how do we express looks the same
In a formal
in
system.
a formal
Yeah.
system? It's a semantic thing, not a syntax thing.
Mhm.
So we're right at the edge of
Actually, one of the fractal patterns that I didn't put up there differs in what depth does at odd numbers, and at even numbers they come back to identical patterns. It relates to the one that you saw that I said it worked for death greater than 1, greater than 2, and greater than 3. Well, this is a diagonal pattern that death greater than 1, greater than 2, and greater than 3. And on odd patterns, either everything gets wiped out in the middle, the 2 endpoints in the middle stay, or everything in the middle stays. But when you come back to the even patterns, they all look the same. Death wipes it all out anyway.
so Jane, if I were a student and interested in following in this, what would be your suggestion of where to attack?
There is a lot of room. There is a lot of room. You could be working on the modeling end. You could be working in this with the grammar. You could be looking at what the effective depth is that I suggested in here.